Jake Morrison stood at the viewing deck of the transport ship and watched the Zentari Institute grow larger in the window. The massive space station looked like a crystal flower floating in the darkness between stars. Hundreds of lights twinkled across its surface, and ships from dozens of different worlds moved around it like busy insects. He checked his acceptance letter one more time. Jake Morrison, Human Earth. Accepted to the Zentari Institute of Cosmic Sciences. He was only the third human ever to get into the most famous university in the galaxy. His hand shook a little as he folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. The transport docked with a soft bump. Jake grabbed his bag and followed the other new students through the airlock. The hallway beyond was huge, with a ceiling that seemed to stretch up forever. Students walked past him, but none of them looked like humans. A tall blue creature with 4 arms waved at the group. "New students, please follow me to orientation," it called out in perfect English. Jake had heard that all galactic citizens learned multiple languages, but it was still strange to hear his own language spoken by someone who looked like a walking tree. Jake found himself walking next to a creature that looked like it was made of living crystal. Light moved through its body in slow waves of different colors. It turned what might have been its head toward him. "You are the human," it said. Its voice sounded like wind chimes. "I am Kelvin 9. I believe we are to be roommates." "Nice to meet you," Jake said. He tried not to stare at the way light danced through Kelvin 9's body. "I'm Jake." "I have read about your species," Kelvin 9 said as they walked. "You come from what we call a death world." Jake laughed. "Death world? That's a bit dramatic. Earth is just normal." Kelvin 9 stopped walking. The lights in his body flickered faster. "Normal? Your planet has moving continents that crash into each other, storms that can destroy entire cities, predators that hunt thinking beings for food." "Well, when you put it like that," Jake said, still smiling. He had never thought of Earth as particularly dangerous. Sure, there were earthquakes and hurricanes, but people dealt with those all the time. They reached a large room filled with students from at least 20 different species. Some looked like giant birds with rainbow feathers. Others moved on tentacles instead of legs. A few seemed to be made of gas held together by force fields. Jake had studied galactic biology, but seeing all these different life forms in person was amazing. The blue creature from before stepped onto a platform at the front of the room. "Welcome to Zentari Institute," it said. "I am Administrator Kel. You have been chosen from millions of applicants across the galaxy. You represent the best minds of your species." Jake felt a surge of pride. He had worked hard to get here. His grades in physics and mathematics had been perfect. He had spent 2 years learning galactic languages and customs. He had even written a research paper on quantum mechanics that his professors called brilliant. "Your first assignment," Administrator Kel continued, "will be given by your professors tomorrow. Use today to meet your classmates and explore the station. Remember, you are here to learn not just science, but how different species approach knowledge." The crowd began to break up. Jake followed Kelvin 9 through corridors lined with windows that showed the stars outside. Other students passed them, talking in languages that sounded like music or static or wind. "Tell me about your world," Jake said as they walked. "What's it like being made of crystal?" "My people evolved in the caves of a moon orbiting a gas giant," Kelvin 9 explained. "Our world is very stable. The same temperature for millions of years. No weather. No predators. We grow slowly and think carefully about everything." They passed a group of the bird-like creatures. One of them, with bright red and gold feathers, looked at Jake with what might have been curiosity or fear. Her feathers seemed to change color slightly when she saw him. "That is Lyra," Kelvin 9 said quietly. "Her people come from a world with very gentle weather and no dangerous animals. They are easily frightened." "Frightened of what?" Jake asked. "Of species like yours," Kelvin 9 said. "Deathworlders have a reputation for being unpredictable." Jake wanted to ask more questions, but they had reached their room. It was larger than he had expected, with 2 sleeping areas and a common space in between. One side had a charging station that Kelvin 9 immediately walked toward. The other side had a bed and desk that looked designed for humans. "Your species requires 8 hours of unconsciousness each day," Kelvin 9 said. "This seems dangerous. What if predators attack while you sleep?" "We evolved ways to wake up quickly if we need to," Jake said. "And we usually sleep in safe places. But how do you know a place is safe?" Jake had never really thought about it. "I guess we just figure it out as we go." Kelvin 9's lights flickered rapidly. "You make decisions without complete information?" That seems very risky. Sometimes you have to take risks to get anywhere, Jake said. He unpacked his clothes and put them in the closet. That's how we discovered fire, agriculture, electricity. Someone had to try new things. My people spend decades studying something before attempting it, Kelvin 9 said. We calculate every possible outcome. That sounds really slow, Jake said without thinking. Then he realized that might be rude. I mean, different species probably have different ways of doing things. Yes, Kelvin 9 said slowly. Different ways. That evening, Jake went to the dining hall. The food was strange but good. Most of it was made of plants he had never heard of, but some dishes tasted almost like things from Earth. He sat at a table with Kelvin 9 and a few other students. Lyra, the bird-like student, joined them. Her feathers were mostly blue now, which Jake had learned meant she was calm. I have heard that humans perform dangerous experiments, she said to Jake. Not dangerous, Jake said. Just thorough. We like to test our ideas. I read that human students sometimes work with radioactive materials, said Dex, a student who looked like an octopus with better coordination. Is this true? In advanced classes, sure, Jake said. With proper safety equipment, of course. All the alien students stared at him. Lyra's feathers turned yellow, which meant fear. Dex's skin changed to a pattern that Jake didn't recognize, but that made Kelvin 9's lights flicker faster. You handle materials that emit deadly radiation? Kelvin 9 asked. It's not that bad if you're careful, Jake said. We wear protective gear and follow safety procedures. My people would never allow students to approach such materials, Lyra said. The risk is too great. But how would you learn about nuclear physics? Jake asked. Through computer simulations, Dex said. Much safer. Jake nodded, but he was thinking that simulations could only teach you so much. Sometimes you had to work with the real thing to understand how it behaved. He decided not to mention that his high school chemistry class had once made small explosions to demonstrate reaction rates. As he got ready for sleep that night, Jake realized that the next few years were going to be very interesting. His new classmates seemed to think humans were crazy risk-takers. Jake just thought of himself as curious. He wondered what they would think when they saw how human scientists actually worked. Outside his window, the stars seemed to twinkle with possibilities. Jake walked into Professor Zenth's classroom 3 weeks after arriving at the Zentari Institute. The professor was an Aquarian, which meant he looked like a very large octopus with too many tentacles and eyes that could look in different directions at the same time. Jake had gotten used to his appearance, but he still found it interesting to watch Professor Zenth write equations on 3 different boards simultaneously. Today we discuss your semester projects, Professor Zenth announced to the class. His voice came from somewhere in the middle of his tentacles and sounded like water bubbling through rocks. Each student must demonstrate a fundamental principle of quantum mechanics using laboratory equipment. Jake looked around the classroom. Lyra was carefully taking notes with a pen that seemed to write in light. Kelvin 9 was recording everything directly into his crystal matrix. Dex was writing with 4 arms at once. All of them looked serious and focused. Your proposals are due next week, Professor Zenth continued. Remember that safety is our primary concern. The universe is dangerous enough without students making it worse. After class, Jake walked with his friends toward the library. They had started eating lunch together every day, and Jake was getting better at understanding their different ways of thinking. I plan to demonstrate wave-particle duality using light refraction, Lyra said. Her feathers were a calm green color. Very safe and predictable. I will show quantum entanglement through crystalline resonance, Kelvin 9 added. No moving parts, no energy discharge. What about you, Jake? Dex asked. Jake had been thinking about this for days. Back on Earth, his physics teacher had once described an experiment that had always fascinated him. I want to create a small particle accelerator to demonstrate quantum superposition at a macro scale. All 3 of his friends stopped walking. Students from other species moved around them in the corridor, but Jake's friends just stared at him. A particle accelerator? Lyra's feathers had gone completely white, which Jake had learned meant extreme fear. Those are used to study the fundamental forces of the universe. Exactly, Jake said, excited that she understood. By accelerating particles to near light speed and making them collide, we can see quantum effects that are usually too small to observe. Jake, Kelvin 9 said slowly, his lights flickering in patterns Jake had never seen before. Particle accelerators require enormous amounts of energy. They can create conditions similar to those inside stars. Not enormous amounts, Jake said. I'm not talking about anything huge. Just enough to accelerate some antimatter particles through a focusing array. Maybe use the university's gravity manipulation equipment to contain the reaction. Dex had turned completely purple, which in his species indicated shock. You want to use antimatter? And gravity manipulation? It's the only way to get the energy levels needed for the demonstration, Jake explained. Don't worry, I've done all the calculations. As long as we keep the antimatter quantities small and use proper magnetic containment, it should be perfectly safe. Perfectly safe, Lyra repeated faintly. She sat down on a nearby bench as if her legs could no longer support her. How small? Kelvin 9 asked. Jake pulled out his tablet and showed them his rough calculations. Maybe enough antimatter to power a small city for a week. That's nothing compared to what the university's power systems handle every day. A week's worth of city power, Dex said in a voice that sounded strangled. Released in seconds. Well, microseconds, actually, Jake corrected. The whole reaction would be over almost instantly. Oh, that makes it much better, Lyra said. Jake was pretty sure she was being sarcastic, though it was hard to tell with alien vocal patterns. Word of Jake's project idea spread through the student body faster than he had expected. By dinner time, students from species he had never spoken to were coming up to his table to ask if it was true that the human wanted to recreate stellar conditions in a laboratory. It's not that dramatic, Jake kept explaining, but no one seemed convinced. Within 2 days, Jake found himself sitting across from Dean Vorthak in the administrative office. The dean was a vegan, which meant he looked like a cloud of glowing gas held together by electromagnetic fields. When he was calm, the gas was blue. Right now it was shifting between red and orange in ways that suggested he was not happy. Mr. Morrison, Dean Vorthak said in a voice that sounded like wind through canyons, your project proposal has caused considerable concern among the faculty. I don't understand why, Jake said honestly. The math is solid. I've checked it 3 times. The mathematics may be correct, Dean Vorthak said, but the proposal violates 17 different safety protocols: antimatter containment, gravity field manipulation, high-energy particle collision. Any one of these could be dangerous. Combined, they represent a risk level that no student has ever attempted. Jake looked at the dean's shifting colors and tried to figure out how to explain. On Earth, graduate students work with particle accelerators all the time. Some universities even let advanced undergraduates assist with experiments. Earth, Dean Vorthak said, and his gas swirled faster. Yes. The death world. It's not a death world, Jake said, getting a little frustrated. It's just a planet where people aren't afraid to try new things. The office door opened and Dr. Patricia Collins walked in. She was the only other human at the university, a professor of applied physics who had been studying galactic science for 20 years. Jake had met her during orientation, but they hadn't talked much since then. Dean Vorthak, Dr. Collins said, nodding politely. Jake, I understand there's some discussion about your project proposal. Dr. Collins, the dean said, his colors shifting to a more respectful purple. Perhaps you can explain to your fellow human why this experiment is inadvisable. Dr. Collins sat down and looked at Jake's proposal on her tablet. She read through it carefully, occasionally making small approving sounds. The calculations look good, she said finally. The energy containment matrix is cleverly designed. The antimatter quantities are well within safe handling limits. Safe handling limits? Dean Vorthak's gas turned bright orange. He wants to work with enough antimatter to power the station's life support systems for days. For a few microseconds, Dr. Collins corrected. In a controlled environment with multiple containment systems, it's actually quite conservative compared to some experiments human students perform. Jake felt relieved that someone understood what he was trying to do. Dr. Collins, Dean Vorthak said carefully, are you saying you support this proposal? I'm saying that Jake's approach represents exactly the kind of thinking that has made human science so innovative, Dr. Collins replied. While other species spend decades planning theoretical studies, humans are willing to test their ideas directly. It's why we've made so many breakthroughs in such a short time. But the risks, Dean Vorthak said, are manageable with proper precautions, Dr. Collins finished. Jake, have you considered using the university's new containment laboratory? The one with the 6-layer isolation system? I didn't know we had one, Jake said. It was built for exactly this kind of advanced research. Multiple force field layers, antimatter-rated containment, emergency isolation protocols. If you're going to test the boundaries of physics, that's the place to do it. Dean Vorthak was quiet for a long moment. His gas swirled in patterns that Jake couldn't interpret. The faculty will need to vote on this, he said finally. An experiment of this magnitude has never been attempted by a student. But it will be considered? Jake asked hopefully. It will be considered, Dean Vorthak agreed, though I suspect the vote will not go in your favor. Jake left the meeting feeling uncertain. He had thought his project was reasonable, maybe even conservative. But clearly the alien faculty saw things differently. That evening, Kelvin 9 found Jake in their room, staring out at the stars. I heard about your meeting with the dean, Kelvin 9 said. Yeah, Jake said. I think I'm in trouble. My people have a saying, Kelvin 9 said. The crystal that grows too quickly cracks under pressure, meaning. Maybe you should consider a simpler project. Light refraction, magnetic resonance, something that won't potentially create a miniature black hole. Jake turned away from the window. Create a black hole? The calculations show that's statistically impossible. Statistically impossible is not the same as impossible, Kelvin 9 pointed out, and even a small probability of destroying the solar system seems too high for most people. Jake realized that his alien friends might have a point. But he also knew that great discoveries came from pushing boundaries, not from playing it safe. He wondered if the faculty would see it that way. Outside, the stars continued to shine, keeping their secrets about the fundamental nature of reality. The faculty meeting lasted 6 hours. Jake waited in his room, trying to study but mostly just staring at his textbooks without reading them. Kelvin 9 sat in his charging station. Lights dimmed with what Jake had learned was worry. Outside their window, the stars seemed farther away than usual. Dr. Collins knocked on their door just after dinner time. Her expression was hard to read, but Jake thought she looked tired. Well? Jake asked. Dean Vorthak approved your experiment, she said. Barely. The vote was 23 against, 22 in favor, with the dean casting the deciding vote. Jake felt his heart jump. Really? They said yes? They said yes with conditions, Dr. Collins corrected. The experiment will be conducted in Laboratory 7, which has the highest security rating on the station. There will be 6 different containment fields active at all times. The antimatter quantities will be reduced to half of what you requested, and every faculty member in the physics department will be monitoring the experiment remotely. That sounds reasonable, Jake said. Kelvin 9's lights flickered rapidly. Laboratory 7 is the one they use for testing experimental weapons, he said. It's designed to contain explosions that could crack a moon, which makes it perfect for Jake's project, Dr. Collins said. You start construction tomorrow morning. That night, Jake could barely sleep. He was excited about finally getting to test his ideas, but he was also nervous about all the attention his project was getting. By morning, half the student body seemed to know that the human was about to attempt something that might destroy local space-time. Jake met Dr. Collins at Laboratory 7 early the next morning. The lab was enormous with walls that looked like they were made of some kind of super-strong metal. Control panels covered every surface, and Jake could see the faint shimmer of multiple force fields in the air. The containment fields are already active, Dr. Collins explained as they walked to the center of the lab. The inner field can contain a nuclear explosion. The second field can stop antimatter reactions. The 3rd through 6th fields are backups in case something goes wrong with the first 2. What about the outer fields? Jake asked. Those are designed to protect the rest of the station if all the inner fields fail simultaneously, Dr. Collins said, which, according to the safety committee, has a probability of less than 1 in 10 billion. Those are good odds, Jake said. The committee seemed to think they were still too high, Dr. Collins replied. Jake spent the first day just familiarizing himself with the equipment. The laboratory had gravity manipulation systems that could create fields strong enough to compress matter into neutronium. It had particle beam generators that could accelerate ions to significant fractions of light speed. It had antimatter storage units that contained enough material to power the entire station for months. This is amazing, Jake said as he read through the equipment manuals. On Earth, we'd need a facility the size of a city to have equipment like this. Most galactic universities have similar setups, Dr. Collins said. They just don't usually let students use them. Why not? Because most students come from species that prefer to understand something completely before touching it, Dr. Collins explained. Humans are unusual in their willingness to learn by doing. On the second day, Jake began setting up his experiment. He needed to create a containment field for the antimatter, align the particle accelerators, and calibrate the gravity manipulation systems to focus the collision point. It was complicated work, but not more difficult than projects he had done in advanced physics classes on Earth. What surprised him was how his alien classmates reacted to. Watching him work, Lyra fainted when Jake reached into an active particle beam to adjust a focusing crystal. The beam was low-powered for calibration, barely enough energy to warm his hand. But to her, it looked like he was casually sticking his arm into something that could vaporize him. It's perfectly safe at these power levels, Jake explained when she woke up. The beam can't penetrate human skin when it's running this low. But what if you accidentally increase the power? Lyra asked. Her feathers were cycling through colors so fast they looked like a rainbow. Then I'd move my hand, Jake said. The safety interlocks would shut everything down anyway. You would move your hand, Lyra repeated. The human reaction to mortal danger is to move slightly. Dex had a similar reaction when Jake mentioned that one of his calculations might be slightly off. If the magnetic containment field is misaligned by more than 0.001%, the antimatter could breach containment and react with normal matter, Jake said while checking his measurements. React how? Dex asked. His skin had turned a color that Jake had never seen before. Well, it would probably just make a small explosion, Jake said, or maybe create a tiny singularity that would evaporate almost immediately. The math says it's very unlikely, though. Dex immediately left the observation area and didn't come back for 2 days. Kelvin 9 was perhaps the most disturbed by Jake's casual attitude toward what he called forces that reshape reality. When Jake asked him to hold a component, while he made adjustments to the gravity field generator, Kelvin 9's crystal structure actually developed a crack from stress. You want me to stand next to a device that can create gravitational fields strong enough to compress carbon into diamond? Kelvin 9 asked. It's not running at full power, Jake said. And you're crystalline, so even if something went wrong, you'd probably just get a little denser. A little denser, Kelvin 9 said faintly. The human thinks being crushed into a different state of matter is a minor inconvenience. Even the alien faculty seemed nervous about Jake's approach to the work. Professor Zenth visited the laboratory every day, watching Jake's progress with all of his eyes while his tentacles moved in patterns that Dr. Collins said indicated extreme anxiety. On my world, Professor Zenth told Jake during one visit, we spend years in preparation before attempting experiments with dangerous materials. This is preparation, Jake said. He was calibrating an antimatter injector while they talked. I'm just doing it hands-on instead of in simulations. But simulations are safer, Professor Zenth pointed out. Sure, but they can't account for every variable, Jake said. Sometimes the real universe behaves differently than the models predict. The only way to know for sure is to try it. Professor Zenth's tentacles, curled up in what Jake had learned was the Aquarian equivalent of a shutter. Dr. Collins tried to explain Jake's behavior to the other faculty members. Humans evolved on a planet where quick decision-making and adaptability were survival traits. She told them during one of their meetings that Jake wasn't supposed to know about. What looks like recklessness to you is actually a very refined form of risk assessment. He handles antimatter like it's a household tool, Dean Vorthak had replied. His species cannot possibly have that much experience with such materials. No, but we have experience with fire, electricity, explosives, radioactive materials, and dozens of other things that can kill us if mishandled, Dr. Collins said. Jake's confidence comes from a lifetime of learning to work safely with dangerous tools. Dangerous tools, Dean Vorthak repeated. Your species considers antimatter a tool. A very useful tool for understanding the fundamental nature of reality, Dr. Collins agreed. By the end of the week, Jake had everything set up and ready for testing. The particle accelerators were aligned, the antimatter containment was stable, and the gravity manipulation systems were calibrated to focus the collision point exactly where he wanted it. He was excited to finally run the experiment and see if his theories about quantum superposition were correct. He had no idea that half the alien students had submitted applications for emergency evacuation. or that the station's insurance company had threatened to cancel their policy, or that 3 different galactic news services were standing by to report on either his success or the destruction of the local solar system. Jake just knew that tomorrow, he would finally get to test whether reality worked the way he thought it did. He fell asleep that night dreaming about particles dancing at the speed of light and the secrets they might reveal about the universe. Jake arrived at Laboratory 7 early Monday morning, carrying a coffee and a sandwich for breakfast. He had learned that caffeine helped him think clearly, and he wanted to be sharp for the most important experiment of his academic career. Dr. Collins was already there, along with Professor Zenth and 3 other faculty members Jake didn't recognize. They all looked nervous, though in different ways depending on their species. Professor Zenth's tentacles were moving in tight, anxious spirals. The bird-like Professor Vell had her feathers compressed flat against her body. Even Dr. Collins seemed more tense than usual. "All the monitoring equipment is active," Dr. Collins told Jake. "Every sensor on the station will be watching this experiment. If anything goes wrong, the automatic systems will shut everything down in microseconds." "Nothing will go wrong," Jake said confidently. "I've checked the calculations a dozen times." Famous last words, Professor Vell muttered in her musical voice. Jake put on his safety gear, which consisted of a simple lab coat and protective glasses. The alien faculty members were watching him from behind 3 layers of shielding, wearing full environmental suits that could protect them from radiation, extreme temperatures, and vacuum exposure. "Is that all the protection you're using?" Professor Zenth asked through the intercom. "This is standard lab safety equipment," Jake replied. "The containment fields will handle anything dangerous." "The containment fields that you built," Professor Zenth pointed out. "With equipment designed by the best engineers in the galaxy," Jake said. "It'll be fine." Jake walked to the control panel and began the startup sequence. The particle accelerators hummed to life with a sound like distant thunder. The gravity manipulation systems created a barely visible distortion in space at the center of the room. The antimatter injection system showed green lights across all its status indicators. In the observation areas around the laboratory, Jake's classmates watched through heavily shielded windows. Lyra was wearing what looked like a full spacesuit. Kelvin 9 had positioned himself behind a barrier designed to stop cosmic rays. Dex had brought a personal force field generator and was hiding behind that. Jake checked his instruments one more time. Everything looked perfect. "Beginning antimatter injection," he announced. A tiny amount of antimatter, smaller than a grain of sand but containing more energy than a nuclear bomb, was fed into the acceleration chamber. Magnetic fields guided it toward the collision point, where it would meet a stream of normal matter particles traveling in the opposite direction. "Particle streams active," Jake reported. "Collision chamber stable. Beginning final acceleration sequence." The humming sound grew louder as the accelerators pushed both streams of particles closer and closer to the speed of light. Energy readings climbed steadily on the monitoring equipment. Jake watched the numbers with satisfaction. Everything was going exactly according to his calculations. 10 seconds to collision, Jake announced. In the observation area, Lyra closed her eyes and began making sounds that might have been prayers. Kelvin 9's lights were flashing so rapidly they looked like a strobe. Even some of the faculty members looked like they were preparing for the worst. 5 seconds, Jake said. 4, 3, 2, 1 collision. The particles met at exactly the right point in space. For a tiny fraction of a second, conditions at the collision point resembled those inside a neutron star. Quantum effects that normally happened on scales too small to observe suddenly became visible to the naked eye. But something unexpected happened. Instead of the controlled demonstration Jake had planned, the collision created a resonance effect with the station's exotic matter power cores. Energy patterns that should have dissipated in microseconds began to form a stable structure. Space itself seemed to ripple around the collision point. Interesting, Jake said, adjusting his instruments to get better readings. I didn't expect that. The alien faculty members were not so calm. Alarms began blaring throughout the laboratory as energy readings climbed far beyond anything in Jake's original calculations. Emergency lights flashed red. Automated warning systems began announcing in 12 different languages that dangerous conditions had been detected. Jake, Dr. Collins's voice came through the intercom, sounding strained. The energy levels are spiking beyond safe parameters. I can see that, Jake said, studying his readouts with fascination. The collision created some kind of stable quantum structure. It's almost like a doorway. A doorway to what? Professor Zenth demanded. Jake peered at the swirling distortion in space where his collision point had been. Through it, he could see what looked like another laboratory, but with subtle differences. The walls were a different color. The equipment was arranged differently. I think it's a doorway to a parallel dimension, he said. In the observation area, Lyra made a sound like a bird having a heart attack and fell over. Dex's personal force field generator exploded from overload. Kelvin 9's crystal structure developed so many cracks that he looked like a broken window. Parallel dimension, Professor Zenth repeated in a voice that sounded like he was having trouble breathing. The human has torn a hole in reality. Not torn, Jake corrected, still fascinated by what he was seeing. More like opened a window, and it looks stable. The quantum field equation suggests it should remain open for several hours at least. The station's emergency systems were going crazy. Every sensor was detecting energy signatures that shouldn't exist. The artificial gravity systems were fluctuating as space-time itself warped around Jake's experiment. In the distance, Jake could hear evacuation alarms starting to sound. Jake, Dr. Collins said urgently, you need to shut it down, now. But this is incredible, Jake protested. Do you realize what this means? We've created a stable wormhole using nothing but particle collision and gravitational focusing. This could revolutionize transportation, communication, maybe even our understanding of the multiverse. It could also destabilize local spacetime and destroy everything within several light years, Professor Zenth pointed out. Jake looked at his readings again. The energy levels were indeed climbing higher than anything he had planned for. But they weren't climbing randomly. There was a pattern to it, a structure that suggested the phenomenon was actually self-stabilizing. Give me a minute, Jake said. I think I can control this. Without waiting for permission, Jake began rerouting power through secondary systems. He used the laboratory's artificial gravity to create a containment sphere around the wormhole. He adjusted the magnetic fields to change the resonance frequency. To the watching aliens, it looked like he was casually playing with forces that could remake reality. What is he doing? Dean Vorthak's voice came through the intercom. Apparently, word of the situation had reached the administration. Problem solving, Dr. Collins replied. It's what humans do. Jake worked quickly but calmly, making adjustments based on real-time observation of how the quantum structure responded to different inputs. Within 10 minutes, he had the energy level stabilized and the wormhole contained within a proper containment field. There, he said with satisfaction. Crisis averted. And we now have a stable interdimensional portal that we can study safely. The laboratory fell silent except for the quiet humming of the containment systems. The alien faculty members stared at Jake through their shielded windows. In the observation area, his classmates looked like they had just watched someone casually reshape the laws of physics while eating a sandwich, which, Jake realized, was pretty much exactly what had happened. The portal is completely stable now, Jake reported. Energy levels are within normal parameters. We can keep it open for detailed study or close it whenever we want. Close it, Dean Vorthak's voice said immediately. But think about the research possibilities, Jake protested. We could learn so much about parallel dimensions, quantum mechanics, the nature of reality itself. We could also accidentally connect to a dimension full of hostile aliens, or create a cascade reaction that destroys both universes, Professor Zenth pointed out. Jake considered this. That seems unlikely based on the energy patterns I'm seeing, but I guess it's theoretically possible. Theoretical possibility of universal destruction is enough, Dean Vorthak said firmly. Close the portal, Mr. Morrison. Jake sighed and began the shutdown sequence. It was disappointing to close such an amazing discovery so quickly, but he could understand why the faculty was nervous. As the energy levels decreased, the wormhole began to shrink. Within minutes, it had collapsed completely, leaving only normal space where the doorway to another dimension had been. Portal closed, Jake reported. Everything back to normal. But as Jake looked around at the faces of his professors and classmates, he realized that nothing would ever be quite normal again. He had just demonstrated that a human student could accidentally revolutionize physics while trying to do a simple class project, and he had done it all while drinking coffee and looking like he was having fun. News of Jake's accidental breakthrough spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Within 6 hours, every major university, research institution, and government science department had received reports about the human student, who had created and controlled an interdimensional portal using improvised equipment and what observers described as terrifying casualness. In the face of universal destruction, Jake spent the afternoon in Dean Vorthak's office, trying to explain what had happened and why he thought it wasn't as dangerous as everyone seemed to believe. "You created a stable wormhole," Dean Vorthak said for the 5th time. His gaseous form was shifting between colors Jake had never seen before. A first-year student accidentally opened a doorway between dimensions. Not accidentally, Jake corrected. The portal formation was an unexpected result, but I was able to control and stabilize it using principles I understood. It wasn't random chance. You understood principles that our greatest physicists have only theorized about, Dean Vorthak pointed out. Different species think about physics differently, Jake said. Humans are good at working with incomplete information and adapting to unexpected results. It's how we've survived on Earth for millions of years. Dr. Collins sat quietly in the corner, occasionally making notes on her tablet. She looked proud and worried at the same time. "The Galactic Science Council wants to interview you," Dean Vorthak continued. "They're calling your achievement the greatest breakthrough in dimensional physics in over 10,000 years. Really? Jake felt excited about that. The Galactic Science Council included the best scientists from hundreds of different worlds. They also want to understand how a species that has been spacefaring for less than a century produced someone capable of manipulating interdimensional physics. Dean Vorthak added, "We're curious," Jake said simply, "and we're not afraid to try things that might not work." That evening, Jake found his alien classmates waiting for him in the dining hall. But their attitudes toward him had completely changed. Instead of fear and concern, they looked at him with something that might have been awe. "Jake," Lyra said as he sat down with his dinner. Her feathers were a deep purple color that Jake had learned indicated respect. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For thinking that human experimental methods were simply reckless," she said. "I realize now that what I saw as dangerous improvisation was actually a sophisticated form of adaptive problem-solving." Kelvin 9's lights pulsed in slow, thoughtful patterns. "My people spend decades calculating every possible outcome before attempting any experiment," he said. "But you achieved in hours what our greatest scientists have been unable to do in centuries." "I just got lucky," Jake said, though he was pleased by their praise. "No," Deck said, his skin showing patterns that indicated deep thought. "I have been studying recordings of your experiment. The way you responded to the unexpected results, the speed with which you understood and controlled new phenomena, the intuitive grasp of cause and effect. This was not luck." "What was it then?" Jake asked. "Evolution," Dr. Collins said, joining their table. "Humans evolved on a world that required constant adaptation to changing, dangerous conditions. Your species developed cognitive patterns that other species never needed." "What kind of patterns?" Lyra asked. "Rapid pattern recognition under stress," Dr. Collins explained. "The ability to make accurate decisions with incomplete information. Comfort with controlled risk-taking. These traits helped humans survive on Earth, but they also make them exceptional experimental scientists." Jake thought about this while he ate. He had never considered that his approach to science might be unusual. To him, it seemed natural to test ideas directly rather than spending years in theoretical preparation. "There's something else," Kelvin 9 said quietly. "Word is spreading among the students from other universities. They're saying that any institution that wants to advance their research should recruit humans." "Why?" Jake asked. "Because humans can do experiments that other species consider impossible," Dex explained. "You work with dangerous materials, high-energy systems, unstable phenomena. You achieve results that we never attempt because we're too cautious." Over the following weeks, Jake's life changed dramatically. Scientists from across the galaxy wanted to meet him and learn about human experimental techniques. The university's research funding increased by 300% as other institutions tried to recruit Dr. Collins and convince Earth to send more human students. Jake was offered immediate admission to the galaxy's most prestigious doctoral programs. Research facilities that had never allowed students to handle dangerous equipment began developing. Human-compatible laboratories with advanced safety systems and emergency protocols, but perhaps the most significant change was in his classmates' attitudes toward risk and experimentation. "I want to try a hands-on approach to my own research," Lyra told Jake one day. My project on electromagnetic resonance in crystalline matrices. Instead of computer simulations, I want to work with actual crystals. That sounds great, Jake said. Just remember to start with low power levels and work your way up. Low power levels, Lyra repeated, making notes. And what if something unexpected happens? Then you observe what's happening, try to understand why, and adapt your approach based on what you learn, Jake said. The unexpected results are often the most interesting. Kelvin 9 began incorporating controlled uncertainty into his research methodology. Instead of calculating every possible outcome in advance, he started allowing for unknown variables and developing strategies to respond to them. His research progress increased dramatically. Even Dex, whose species was naturally cautious, began experimenting with what he called guided improvisation in his studies of quantum entanglement in biological systems. Professor Zenth announced that the physics department would begin offering a new course called Adaptive Experimental Methodology based on human approaches to scientific research. It would be taught jointly by Dr. Collins and Jake, making him the youngest instructor in the university's history. But I'm still a student, Jake protested when Professor Zenth offered him the position. You're a student who has revolutionized our understanding of dimensional physics, Professor Zenth replied. I think you're qualified to teach other students how to think like a human scientist. The first class was packed with students from dozens of different species, all eager to learn what they now called Deathworlder methodology. Jake felt nervous standing in front of so many alien faces, but he tried to explain his approach as simply as possible. The most important thing to understand, Jake told them, is that failure isn't something to be afraid of. It's information. When an experiment doesn't work the way you expected, that tells you something about how the universe really behaves. A student who looked like a walking tree raised what might have been a hand. But what if the failure is dangerous? Then you learn to manage the danger, Jake said. You use safety equipment, containment systems, emergency protocols, but you don't let the possibility of danger stop you from learning. What if the failure could be catastrophic? Asked another student. Jake thought about this carefully. Then you make sure you understand the risks, prepare for multiple contingencies, and proceed carefully but confidently. The universe is dangerous, but it's also comprehensible. If you approach it with respect but not fear, it will teach you its secrets. After class, Jake walked to his favorite observation deck and looked out at the stars. In the distance, he could see ships from Earth arriving with more human students and researchers. The galaxy was changing, becoming more willing to take the risks necessary for real discovery. His tablet chimed with a message from the Galactic Science Council. They had approved his proposal for a new research project, using controlled wormhole generation to study the fundamental structure of space-time. It would be the largest and most ambitious experiment in galactic history. Jake smiled as he read the proposal details. The project would require working with exotic matter, manipulating gravity on stellar scales, and potentially opening doorways to dimensions that had never been explored. Most species would consider it impossibly dangerous. To Jake, it sounded like Tuesday. He was already looking forward to seeing what the universe would teach him next, and he had a feeling his alien classmates were finally ready to learn alongside him. After all, the best discoveries always came from asking dangerous questions and having the courage to seek dangerous answers. The stars seemed to twinkle with approval, as if the universe itself was excited to reveal more of its secrets to creatures brave enough to look.